Welcome to part 3 of the C2 development series. In the last video, we built this type which is responsible for managing connections. However, we encountered an issue where the server doesn't clean up closed connections. In this video, we'll implement functionality that automatically removes sessions when clients disconnect. The way we're going to detect disconnects is by implementing some mechanism that periodically checks whether the connection is alive, let's say once a second. I'll begin by creating a new file. I'll call it client-utils.go. In this file, we are going to write some useful functions that actually interact with the client, which is this one here. Let's create a function that sends some message to the client. If sending data to the connection is at all possible, this means the connection is alive. If attempting to write to the connection returns an error, we can report the connection as closed. We will receive a parameter that is the connection, and we will return a boolean, whether or not the connection is alive. Now we will attempt writing to the connection. We can do this with the write method of our connection object. As you can see, the write method takes a byte slice as a parameter, and that is why we are casting this string as a byte slice. The method also returns the number of bytes written, which we don't need, that's why we are discarding it, and an error, which we do need. If there was an error writing to the connection, we know the connection is not alive. Let's check the error. If the error is nil, so there is no error, we return true. Connection is alive. Otherwise, we return false. The connection is not alive. We can actually simplify this logic to this. Here we need to do a small modification to the client. As we send these alive checks, the client might interpret them as commands and try to execute this string here, which is not a valid command. We need to let the client know that when this string is sent, we don't need to execute it, we can just skip. So let's check it. If the command is an alive check, we can simply continue. Let's also add a print statement for debugging. Now our client can differentiate between actual commands and this alive check string. Now let's create a type that is going to constantly check if a connection is alive using this function. I'll call it disconnectMonitor. And let's define our type. Let's define a check interval field. This field will let the object know how often we want to send alive checks. And also let's define a channel. Whenever a session is disconnected, this object is going to notify whoever is listening via this channel. It's going to be a write-only channel because this object will only send connections that are disconnected. This structure is actually similar to our server. The same way the server notifies whoever is listening that a new connection has been established, the disconnect monitor is going to notify whoever is listening that a new session has disconnected. Let's create an initializer function. Now let's create a method that checks if a connection is alive. It's going to take a connection as an argument, it's going to return a boolean, whether the connection is alive. Here we can use the function that we created in our utils file. And we pass this connection to this function. Now let's create the method that is actually going to repeatedly send checks to the client. In an infinite loop, we can call this method that we created to check if the connection is alive. If the connection is not alive, we send that connection over the disconnect channel. In a case the connection is not alive, there is no longer a need to monitor that connection. So we can exit that method. The way it currently is, this method is going to perform a very large amount of checks. So let's delay it by the interval. We are going to sleep this method for as much seconds as this check interval is. With that, our type is now done. Let's go to the main function and use it. Let's create a new disconnect channel. Let's initialize an object of our new type. The check interval is going to be 1 second and we are passing this channel here. Now, the same way we have a function for handling new connections, we need to create another handler function that is going to handle new disconnections. We are going to take a receive-only channel as a parameter for our disconnect channel and the session manager, so we can remove the session from our connection slice. Just like we did here, let's iterate over the disconnect channel and let's remove the connection from our session manager. Let's print a message to the user. We print that the connection to where the session came from has closed. Finally, let's call close on this connection object just in case. Now there is one last thing we have to do before calling the handle disconnects function. And that is, we need to actually call this monitoring method that we implemented here. Where are we going to call this method? If you thought that we need to call it in the new connections handler, you are right. So let's add a parameter for the disconnection monitor. And let's start monitoring every new connection that we receive by calling the disconnectMonitor.startMonitoring method on it. Of course, it is very important to monitor every connection on a separate Go routine. Otherwise, the new connection handler is not going to be able to receive any new connections before this specific connection has closed, because the code will stop executing on this line until the start monitoring method returns. So let's run it on a new Go routine. Now we are monitoring every new connection that we receive. We just need to handle the disconnects. Also, I forgot when calling the new connection handler, let's now pass our disconnect monitor object. And now let's start handling disconnections. Just like the new connections handler, we also need to call the disconnect handler on a new Go routine. Otherwise, this handler is going to interfere with the user input that we implemented right here. Because once this line of code is reached, the main Go routine will not continue to the next lines until this function returns. But as we can see, this function never returns. Or rather, it returns when the disconnect channel is closed, but we are not closing it anywhere. So let's call it on a new Go routine. Okay, let's save everything and see if it is working. Let's run our server and let's connect the client. As we can see, a connection has appeared. Let's check the sessions. We have a session. And as we can see, we are receiving an alive check on the client every second and we are ignoring it. That is exactly how we implemented it here. So now let's try and close the connection from the client side. As we can see, we immediately got notified on the server side. And if we check the sessions now, we can see that there are no longer any sessions available. Let's connect again, and we see a message that a new connection has appeared. Let's connect another client. Let's check sessions. We now have 2 sessions. Let's disconnect one client. The server immediately notices that, and now the connection is removed. Let's close the other one. And it is also removed from the sessions. In the next video, we are going to start implementing shell interaction via the sessions. See you there.